I hear that in your era, my paintings easily fetch hundreds of millions at auction houses. Canvas tote bags and phone cases printed with Impression sunrise are everywhere. To use the slang of you young folks, this old man has completely gone viral and is absolutely trendy as hell. Every time I hear this, I usually just take a puff from my pipe and smile a wry smile. If those salon judges back then, the ones who dismissed my paintings as worthless and called me a madman, could see this, they'd probably be so furious they'd jump right out of their graves. But truthfully, I never really got to enjoy this overwhelming wealth during my lifetime. If one had to summarize Claude Monet's life, it would be a foregone conclusion. I spent my entire life doing just one thing and loving just one person. That path was not an easy one to walk. The dark side of my reality is the wretchedness of perpetually failing to pay rent, the humiliation of begging and borrowing everywhere just to buy a single tube of expensive ultramarine paint. It is a bottomless, bone-chilling cold. But so what? When the breaking sunlight of dawn pierced the thin mist over the Seine River, and the water's surface unexpectedly shattered into a shimmering expanse of orange-pink waves, I completely left this damn reality behind. Holding my palette, I ran in the wind, chasing the sun like a madman. In my eyes, there are only two kinds of light. One is the fleeting light and shadow between heaven and earth. The other is the light forever branded in my heart, from when my wife Camille lifts her dark green dress and turns back to smile at me on a breeze-swept meadow. This is my story. There are no lofty art theories here, just a stubborn poor boy who spent his entire life fiercely clinging to that ray of light and the woman standing within it. Now let me slowly tell it to you. If you were strolling down the streets of the port of Le Havre in 1850 and happened to walk into a sizable grocery store, you would most likely see a scene like this. Standing behind the counter would be a shrewd and capable man, my father, Adolphe. He was rapidly flicking the abacus beads with his rough fingers, his eyes glued to the profits in the ledger. Meanwhile, crouching in the shadows at the corner of the counter was a thoroughly bored 15-year-old boy. That was me. Honestly, in the old man's eyes, I was simply an incomprehensible weirdo. He watched the merchant ships sailing in and out of the harbor, seeing only vessels brimming with spices, coffee beans, and gleaming francs. Yet when I looked at that same sea, all I saw were the reflections of masts shattered by the wind on the water's surface and the fading gray-blue sunset in the distance. Claude, stop reading that useless stuff and come learn how to read the ledgers. You'll be taking over this shop one day. That was the phrase I heard most often during my childhood. In today's terms, the life path my dad mapped out for me was to be a carefree, second-generation business heir, safely becoming a successful man in the worldly sense. But to me, it was nothing short of a prison. That grocery store, reeking of dried salted fish and stale dust, was the coffin that buried my soul. Fortunately, in that suffocating home, there was still a single ray of light, my mother, Louise. She was a singer, possessing the sensitivity and gentleness of an artist. Whenever my father scolded me harshly for skipping school to draw by the sea, she would secretly pull me over to the fireplace and slip a few clean sheets of sketch paper and charcoal pencils into my hands. The dancing firelight reflected in her gentle eyes as she stroked my head and said softly, "Paint, Claude. Paint the truth you see." In that bleak world where everyone thought I was wasting my life, my mother's support was the only shield I had to defend myself against reality. Don't think I've always been a melancholic boy who only knows how to stare at the scenery. To rebel against the mind-numbingly boring classes at school, I found an outlet to vent my frustrations, drawing comics. I started drawing exaggerated caricatures of the town's local elites, politicians, and those stuffy teachers. I would draw their noses like giant red potatoes and their bodies like shriveled bamboo poles. Who would have thought? These spoof-like caricatures actually became a massive hit locally. Just like the influencers in your era who go viral by creating memes, I even started taking commissions and making money. A single drawing could sell for up to 20 francs. Back then, walking the streets of Le Havre with my pocket stuffed with coins, I felt like an absolute business prodigy, a super cool little genius. It went straight to my head. I thought all those landscape painters were nothing but a bunch of whining old fogies. Until one day, fate dealt me a resounding slap in the face, or rather, a profound awakening. I met Eugène Boudin, a landscape painter who always wore a shabby coat, shivering in the cold sea breeze with an easel slung over his shoulder. At first, I completely looked down on his ordinary seascape paintings, but he didn't hold my childish arrogance against me. Instead, he pulled me out of that art studio, a place filled only with exaggerated lines and vain praises, and brought me into the real sunlight. I will never forget that day. The sea breeze scraped across my cheeks with coarse grains of salt. Boudin pointed to the distant horizon and said to me, "Claude, look closely. Paint the air, paint the light." When I set up my easel outdoors for the very first time, clumsily trying to capture with paint that patch of sunlight rapidly being obscured by dark clouds, I suddenly felt an unprecedented thrill. I realized that all the comics I used to draw were dead, whereas the nature before my eyes was alive and breathing. Light and shadow shifted with every passing second. The edges of the leaves shimmered and the ripples on the water danced. In that moment, that arrogant young comic artist died. Amidst the howling sea winds of Normandy, I discovered the only faith of my life: light. But just as I thought I had grasped the paintbrush of destiny, the dark side of reality descended in the most brutal way. On January 28, 1857, the gentlest warm hue in my life was mercilessly erased by God. My mother passed away. The woman who used to secretly slip me sketch paper is gone. The house has completely turned into a freezing ice cellar. Without my mother there to act as a buffer, the conflict between my father and me completely erupted. The old man gave me an ultimatum with no way out. Either get back to the grocery store right now and run the business properly, or I'll cut off all your financial support and you can go beg on the streets. Compromise? Return behind that counter reeking of dried salted fish and spend the rest of my life like a soulless abacus? Never. I would rather starve to death in front of my easel than bow to mediocrity. I rejected him without hesitation. To completely escape that family, I made a crazy decision. I volunteered for military service. I would rather be cannon fodder on the battlefield than a petty, mercenary businessman. And just like that, I was assigned to the 1st African Light Cavalry Regiment and shipped off to faraway Algeria. Those were days suspended between heaven and hell. You could never imagine just how savage the North African sun was. The light there didn't merely shine on people, it battered them. That almost violent bright orange, the blinding ochre, and a cobalt blue so profound it made you dizzy, mercilessly assaulted my retinas. It was an absolute visual feast, but it was accompanied by a cruel reality. Life in the military camp was worse than that of animals, and I soon contracted deadly typhoid fever. In that cramped, stifling military tent, I ran a high fever, drenched in cold sweat, lacking the strength to lift even a single finger. I stared fixedly at a faint beam of light piercing through the top of the tent, watching the dust motes swirl within it. A bitter smile crossed my mind. Claude Monet, you spent your life chasing light, only to die so ridiculously in the dark? But as luck would have it, I survived. My aunt, who was old-fashioned but still cared for me, couldn't bear to watch any longer. She spent a fortune to hire a substitute to finish my remaining military service, snatching me back from the jaws of death. However, she also laid down a condition. Since you insist on painting, then go to Paris. Go to the most traditional art studio and learn to paint like a respectable gentleman. And so, I arrived in Paris and stepped into the famous Studio Glare. But what my aunt didn't know was that if the grocery store was a coffin for burying the flesh, then the traditional Parisian art studio was a tomb for strangling the artistic soul. Can you imagine? In those dimly lit rooms, where thick curtains blocked the windows and daylight was banished all year round, we young artists were forced to copy lifeless plaster casts day after day. The professors would constantly scold me from their pedestals. "Monet, nature is too coarse. You must learn to embellish it. How can you have purple and blue in your shadows? Shadows must be painted with black and bitumen." Black? There is no absolute black in nature. Under the sun, even the soil in the shade of a tree shimmers with a faint violet hue. They aren't teaching us how to paint. They are teaching us how to manufacture glamorous corpses. This oppression drives me to the brink of madness. But fortunately, when you find yourself at the bottom of a massive, dark abyss, You are always the quickest to spot the other lunatics who, just like you, are desperately trying to climb out. In that lifeless art studio, I met a few guys with the same rebellious gleam in their eyes as me. Renoir, the ever-smiling tailor's son whose brushstrokes captured the warmth of human flesh. Basile, the tall, wealthy young man who loved defying tradition. And Cicely, quiet and reserved, yet profoundly obsessed with landscapes. The four of us were practically the Avengers of the Parisian art scene back then. We would huddle together, staring at the rigid neoclassical paintings in the studio, and mock them without hesitation. This is just a pile of lifeless trash. Until one day, we simply couldn't take it anymore. Like condemned prisoners escaping a dungeon, we fled the suffocating stone forest of Paris without looking back, carrying our easels and paints, and plunged into the vast world of Fontainebleau. There we had no professors dictating to us, no blackened plaster casts. There was only the dappled shade of trees overhead, the howling wind in our ears, and the vast forest breathing fiercely in the sunlight before us. Sitting in the mud and gnawing on hard, dry baguettes, we greedily smashed those fleeting, ever-changing light and shadows, those dancing colors, onto our canvases. Back then, we were completely broke, having to pool our money just to buy a single tube of good paint. In the eyes of the salon judges, we were nothing but a bunch of unruly clowns. But on that afternoon, with sunlight shattering through the oak leaves, as we looked at each other and laughed, none of us realized that this group of down-and-out rebellious youths was about to ignite a fire that would burn down the entire traditional art world. And that name, which would shock the world decades later, Impressionism, had quietly completed its most passionate first cry in this very moment. In your era, to prove yourself a successful artist, you might need tens of thousands of followers and astronomical auction records. But in 1865 Paris, there was only one path, hanging your paintings on the walls of the official art salon. It was a true Vanity Fair, the ultimate gathering place for the top tier of the entire European art circle. The salon judges were a bunch of monocle-wearing old pedants who reeked of mothballs. What did they like? They liked naked Venuses, highly staged ancient Greek heroes, and lifeless surfaces painted to look like polished marble. And me? A penniless young guy who often couldn't even pay rent, whose pockets were completely empty, audaciously sent them two paintings, two seascapes carrying the salty tang of the Normandy sea breeze, painted with rough, bold brush strokes. To be honest, I wasn't feeling confident when I sent it in. Compared to those exquisite court paintings, my work felt like a barbarian in worn-out straw sandals crashing a high society banquet. But fate loves to play jokes. They actually accepted it. Not only did they accept it, but they also hung it in a prime spot. When I squeezed through the crowd on opening day and saw a group of gentlemen in tailcoats and ladies holding parasols gathered around my painting, pointing and even gasping in amazement, can you imagine that feeling? It's just like you young people today suddenly creating a massive viral video that takes over the internet. At that moment, I heard the heavy, seductive roar of the gates of fame and fortune opening for me. I, Claude Monet, had finally made a name for myself in Paris. I admit that slight twinge of vanity made me tipsy, like a strong spirit. I felt absolutely invincible. I felt as though the entirety of Paris was at my feet. Once a man tastes success, his ambition grows wildly like weeds. What were two mere seascapes? I was going to pull off something massive. I wanted to challenge the true big brother of the art world at the time, the man who always managed to stir up enormous controversy, Edouard Monet. Monet had previously painted Luncheon on the Grass. By depicting a naked woman alongside a few men in suits, he nearly gave the Parisian critics a heart attack. Although that painting shocked the world, in my eyes, it was still too fake. The light and shadow on the figures were completely unnatural. You could tell at a glance it was pieced together inside a gloomy studio. "I am going to paint a real Luncheon on the Grass," I roared, slamming the table in the tavern at my good friend Renoir and the others. "I will paint a masterpiece 6 meters wide and 4 meters high outdoors in the sunlight. I want the real dappled shadows of the trees to fall across the face of every single character. I want to deliver a complete and utter shock to those old fogies in Paris. I am an absolute madman." To paint this masterpiece, I hired an ox cart to haul a canvas as massive as a ship's sail into the forest of Fontainebleau. The canvas was too tall for me to reach the top, so guess what? I actually dug a deep trench in the woods like a groundhog. I lowered the canvas into the trench just so I could paint the topmost leaves. Every day I crawled and wrestled in the mud pit, my body covered in dirt, fallen leaves, and expensive paint. My pockets grew emptier, and my debts snowballed, but the light in my eyes shone brighter and brighter. Until one day, while searching for a figure model for my painting, God threw me the biggest blind box of my life. That afternoon, the light in the forest took on an almost transparent honey gold hue. I was biting my paintbrush in frustration, complaining about the stiff pose of the hired model. Just then, the shadows of the bushes were gently parted by a pair of pale, pristine hands. A girl stepped through. Her name was Camille Dancieux, and she was only 18 that year. How can I even describe the scene at that moment to you? I swear, it was absolutely the most incredible magic of light and shadow I have ever witnessed in my entire life. Sunlight filtered through the canopy of towering oak trees, turning into countless golden specks that fluttered down onto her raven-black hair and slightly furrowed brow. She lacked the affected coquetry of Parisian ladies. Her eyes held a touch of innocent aloofness, yet concealed a gentleness that made one irresistibly want to draw closer. The moment she followed my instructions, reclining on the white cloth spread across the grass, and turned her head slightly to look at me, the entire bustling forest suddenly fell silent. The wind stopped, the birdsong vanished. It felt as though my heart had been struck fiercely by a soft, heavy hammer. Before meeting Camille, there were only two things in my eyes: paintings that could sell, and paintings that couldn't. But the second I met her, it was as if nature had revealed its trump card to me. I suddenly understood that all those fleeting lights and shadows I had been so obsessed with were meant solely to illuminate her face in this very moment. Reality is so cruel, burdened with massive debts. I could be thrown out into the street by my landlord along with my paintings at any moment. I am a pauper who doesn't even know where his next meal is coming from. That is my dark side. Yet when Camille sits quietly in front of my canvas, gazing at me with those clear eyes, I possess the purest light in the entire world. But romance doesn't fill the stomach. In the spring of 1866, disaster struck. That massive painting, Luncheon on the Grass, had completely spiraled out of control. The canvas was too large, the outdoor lighting changed too rapidly, and there was absolutely no way I could finish it before the salon deadline. Meanwhile, creditors began pounding on my door frantically, like hyenas smelling blood. "Monet, if you can't pay the rent, we'll take your paintings to clear your debt." The roaring from outside cut through my nerves like a knife. If I couldn't exhibit my work at this year's salon and sell it for a good price, not only would my reputation be in ruins, but I wouldn't even be able to protect Camille. I fell into utter despair. In that cramped, gloomy studio that smelled of pungent turpentine, I paced back and forth like a trapped beast. There were less than 4 days left until the final submission deadline for the salon. 4 days. Not even enough time to paint a sketch. Just as I was on the verge of a breakdown, Camille quietly walked to the corner, pulled a silk gown from a trunk, and slipped it on. It was a heavy, faintly gleaming emerald green gown with black stripes. Wearing it, she turned her back to me and then glanced back slightly over her shoulder. "Claude," she said softly, "paint me." At that moment, a bolt of lightning pierced through the chaos in my mind. The flowing silk on the skirt's hem reflected light, and the deep emerald green color created a striking contrast with her pale, delicate skin. It was absolutely beautiful. "Don't move, Camille, please. Stay in that position. Don't move at all." Like a mad gambler, I grabbed the largest brush and began frantically painting on the canvas. There were no sketches, no careful underpainting. I was racing against time, using my life and whatever sanity I still had left. The next 96 hours were like a hellish ordeal. I didn't eat or sleep, my eyes bloodshot from exhaustion. All that could be heard in the studio was the sound of the brush rubbing against the rough canvas, along with my heavy breathing. I crushed all my anxiety, all my fear, and my most passionate love for this woman, smashing them into those massive swaths of green paint. Camille stood there quietly, often for hours on end. She was so exhausted that her face turned pale and her legs trembled, yet she bit her lip, never uttering a single complaint. She knew she wasn't just acting as my model. She was using her own body to build the final line of defense for my dream. 4 days later, the woman in the green dress was submitted to the salon. The result? An absolute explosion. The astonishing texture of that green dress, along with Camille's vivid backward glance, stunned all of Paris. Even the most acerbic critic, Émile Zola, couldn't help but step forward to champion me. This is a woman painted by a real man. This painting was not only sold for a high price, alleviating my urgent financial needs, but it also propelled me to an unprecedented pinnacle of fame. Everyone thought I had found the master key to wealth and prestige. They assumed I would be like other painters, mingling with Paris's glamorous socialites and painting various portraits to cater to the market. But they were wrong. They didn't understand Claude Monet at all. The woman in the green dress did indeed change my destiny, but what transformed me wasn't the handsome compensation. It was the person in the painting. From that day on, I made an almost obsessive resolution. My paintbrush would never again linger on another woman. In the years that followed, whether I was so destitute that I had to gnaw on cold bread in the freezing snow, or forced by life to flee from place to place, whether in a sunlit garden or on a windswept cliff, whenever a woman's figure appeared in my paintings, it could only be Camille. She was the ethereal sprite twirling lightly on the grass with a parasol. She was the demure wife sitting on a bench, head bowed in embroidery. She was the one indispensable soul in all my landscapes. They say Impressionist painters are hunters of light and shadow, caring only for fleeting appearances. But only I know that all the light I have chased throughout my entire life actually lingered on that 18-year-old girl in the green dress, looking back at me with a smile. You probably think that since the woman in the green dress sold for a good price, I'd be able to live a fairy tale life with Camille, right? Too naive. In this messed up reality, romance has always been a luxury, while poverty is an inescapable terminal illness. The success of that painting was like a fleeting shooting star. Soon enough, those old fogies at the salon shut my paintings out once again. They felt the brushstrokes in my work were becoming increasingly frantic and unruly. Meanwhile, my father back in my hometown finally found out about Camille and me. The old man was furious and gave me an ultimatum. Leave that lowly model, or I will cut off every last franc of your financial support. If I compromised, I could return to a warm hearth. If I didn't, I would be left to wander the streets with my pregnant Camille. To me, there was still only one answer to this choice. I chose Camille, fully embracing a plunge headfirst into the abyss. The winter of 1867 was so cold that our breath seemed to freeze in our lungs. Our son Jean was born. In a moment that should have been purely joyful, I couldn't even afford a single piece of coal to light a fire to keep Camille warm. I watched her lying weakly on a ragged mattress, her lips purple from the cold, as she piled every torn scrap of clothing and thin blanket she could find onto our newborn baby. Creditors had chased us out into the streets. No one bought my paintings, and old acquaintances who once called me brother now went out of their way to avoid me. I had become an absolute joke, a complete failure who couldn't even feed his own wife and child. On that summer night in 1868, I broke down completely. Like a walking corpse, I wandered onto a bridge over the Seine River. Looking down at the dark, heavy river water beneath the bridge, I felt it was the only place in this world that would accept me. If I just jumped, if my lungs just filled with water, I wouldn't have to face the landlord's cold glares anymore, nor would I have to watch Camille starve. I closed my eyes and jumped. The river swallowed me instantly, its coldness piercing to the bone. But in that second of suffocation, a face suddenly shattered the darkness. It was the look in Camille's eyes. That foolish woman in the green dress who had gambled her entire life on a penniless loser like me. If I died, how would she and our child survive? The instinct to live conquered my cowardice. I thrashed my limbs desperately, dragging myself onto the muddy riverbank like a wretched, drowning dog. I collapsed in the muck and wailed. At that moment, I knew that Claude Monet had died in that river. The one who crawled ashore was a madman who would never be broken by any hardship again. What do you think someone who just crawled back from death's door would do? Find a decent job? No, I told you, I'm a madman. Since reality couldn't possibly get any worse, I decided to stake my very life on my easel. We moved to a remote seaside village, where we were met with a long, harsh blizzard. That became the most incredibly manic, creative period of my life. I thrust my easel deep into half a meter of snow, letting the freezing, sub-zero winds slice across my face like blades. My fingers were frozen stiff and cracked, the paint inside the tubes turning to icy grit. I had to have someone stand beside me holding a portable stove, warming myself while I painted. Yet, in this maddening extreme cold, I caught a glimpse of the hidden trump card God kept concealed behind the world. It was late afternoon, the sunlight striking the snowfield at a low, slanting angle. I stared intently at the expanse of snow that was supposed to be pure white and the shadows of the trees that were supposed to be pure black. Suddenly, it was as if I had been struck by lightning. No, snow isn't white at all. Under the refraction of sunlight, it is a sparkling rosy pink, a warm orange. And those shadows, my God, there isn't a single drop of black paint in those shadows. They are translucent violet, deep cobalt blue. In that world of ice and snow, on the verge of freezing to death, I finally grasped the ultimate secret of Impressionism. There is no such thing as an object's inherent color in this world. All colors are light-speaking, light-breathing. I wildly wielded my brush across the canvas in ecstasy. What did the freezing reality matter? I had stolen all the sunlight in the universe onto my palette. Having survived the most difficult years, we finally welcomed a spring so brief it felt like an illusion. Those were our days in Argentour. After our flight from the Franco-Prussian War, Camille and I were officially married. I built a small studio boat on the Seine, drifting along with the current every day. Do you remember the painting Poppies at Argentour? It remains the brightest memory of my entire life. In the early summer breeze, a hillside covered in scorching red poppies swayed gently. Camille, holding her blue parasol, walked slowly toward me through the sea of flowers with our son. The scene was filled with an abundance of bright yellow, emerald green, and vivid red. At that moment, I felt like the richest person in the world. I wanted to freeze time forever in that sea of flowers. But fate, that cruel screenwriter, always delights in tearing beautiful things apart right before your eyes at the very best of times. Prolonged drifting, enduring hunger and cold, combined with successive childbirths, had completely drained Camille's body. Pelvic cancer, like an invisible demon, relentlessly gripped her. In her 30s, she withered rapidly. Her once full cheeks became hollow, and the eyes that used to gaze at me with such tenderness lost their light. And the most despairing part was that we had once again fallen into absolute destitution. I could only act like a beggar, frantically writing to every friend I had, "Please lend me a little money, even just a few francs. Camille is tossing and turning in agony all night, and I need money to buy her painkillers." I had captured all the light in the world with my paintbrush, yet I could not hold on to the only light in my life. September 5th, 1879. The darkest moment of my life. On that morning, in this shabby room, Camille took her last breath. She was only 32. I stood right by her bed, watching her stop breathing. What happened next would make me want to slap myself in the face every time I recalled it in the decades that followed. This is the cruelest, coldest curse of being an artist. As I watched the love of my life turn into a cold corpse, my mind should have been consumed by overwhelming grief. Yet those eyes, trained for so long to capture light and shadow, damnably and uncontrollably set to work. I was subconsciously observing the colors death painted on her face. I watched the warm hues of life drain from her once rosy skin, a horrifying grayish blue creeping outward from her eye sockets. I noticed a faint purple reflection surfacing along her jawline, and that bleak, fading yellow lingering on her cheekbones. "Claude Monet, you are an absolute monster." I frantically cursed myself in my mind. My tears smashed against the floor, yet like a possessed machine, I stumbled toward the easel, snatched up my brushes, and rushed back to her bedside. I had to paint her. I had to nail her final light and shadows onto the canvas before she was completely swallowed by the darkness. I slashed paint onto the canvas in a state of near madness. The entire surface was filled with cold blues, gloomy purples, and pale whites. The brushstrokes were no longer the light, agile touches of my landscapes, but violent, desperate, and as frantic as a blizzard. I was fighting death to preserve her face. As the final brushstroke landed, my strength drained away, and I fell to my knees beside the bed. Camille in the painting was already covered in a layer of frost-like colors, her eyes closed forever. With trembling hands, in the bottom right corner of the canvas where I should have signed Claude Monet, I painted a tiny, highly concealed heart with the utmost restraint. Out of the countless paintings in my lifetime, that was the only time I ever painted a heart, because at that moment my own heart was buried forever, along with that cold canvas and the girl in the green dress. After Camille passed away, the door to my life completely closed. In the historical records of later generations, my second wife, Alice, is always mentioned. She was an extremely capable and formidable woman. When I was at my lowest, on the verge of a breakdown, she was the one who took over that crumbling home and raised the children Camille and I had. I am grateful to her, and I respect her. Eventually, we married. But an artist's heart is sometimes colder than the Seine in winter. Alice was a living, breathing woman. She felt jealousy. She was jealous of Camille, who had long turned to bone, yet still fiercely possessed my soul. One day, returning home from the studio, I caught the scent of burning drifting from the backyard. I stood quietly by the door, watching Alice throw Camille's letters, ribbons, and that green dress that had once stunned all of Paris, piece by piece, into the brazier. The firelight flickered across her face as she stared intently at me, as if waiting for an outburst, or even just a single word of reproach. But I said nothing. I simply turned around in silence and walked back to the studio. Many people think I am a coward, that I am heartless, but how could they understand? I don't care at all about those dead objects being reduced to ashes. Because the real Camille had long been sealed onto the canvas by me with pigments, sealed within the sunlight and gentle breezes. Fire can burn away ribbons, but it can never burn away that eternally vivid gleam of light. Ever since that freezing morning of September 5th, 1879, I set an iron rule for myself, stricter than death. I, Claude Monet, shall never paint a portrait of any woman again in this life. In front of my easel, an empty space will forever remain. Alice stayed by my side for 30 years, yet I never, not even once, painted her into my canvases. From then on, my brushstrokes belonged solely to the sky, the rivers, the bridges, and the trees. Because in my world, the leading lady has already taken her final bow. This play no longer needs any understudy. Fate, sometimes, is like a cruel joke. Only a few years after Camille died in despair, plagued by poverty and illness, my paintings suddenly became highly sought after across the art markets of Europe and America. The art dealers who once shut me out now line up waving their checkbooks, begging for even a sketch whose paint hasn't yet dried. I finally have money. I can buy the most luxurious carriages in Paris. I can custom order the most expensive silk dresses. But the woman who starved with me in the heavy snow and struggled alongside me in the mud, the woman I swore to give a good life, now sleeps forever beneath the cold earth. To me, this immense wealth has become the most vicious irony. With this money that could never buy back my true love, I did something everyone considered utterly insane. I fled Paris and bought a vast tract of land in Giverny. I hired 6 gardeners and even altered the course of a local river. Here, with my own hands, I will build a world that belongs only to me. I planted tens of thousands of irises, tulips, and peonies. I dug out a massive pond and built a Japanese-style wooden bridge. On the water's surface, I planted an abundance of those plants called waterlilies. People marveled at the luxury and beauty of the garden in Giverny, thinking it was a paradise for me to enjoy my later years. But in reality, it was a colossal enclosed realm where time stood still. I shut the whole world out, waking up at 4 a.m. every day to wander by the pond like a ghost. I didn't paint the distant mountains or the people on the shore. My gaze was fixed intensely on that expanse of water. The water's surface is a magical thing. It possesses nothing, yet it reflects the drifting clouds in the sky, the silhouettes of trees, and the fleeting patches of dappled light. Upon the surface of the water, I search for some elusive, ethereal eternity. Every blooming water lily bears a striking resemblance to Camille's clear eyes as she looked at me beneath the tree shadows of Fontainebleau so many years ago. If poverty and death were the first two critical blows fate dealt me, then the third, arriving in my twilight years, is nothing short of a devastating dimensional strike. I, an impressionist grandmaster who staked my entire life's faith on vision and light and shadow, have been afflicted with severe cataracts. Heaven is finally taking back my trump card. You could never imagine that slow, lingering despair like a death by 1,000 cuts. At first, the world in my eyes began to turn yellow, as if coated in a layer of cheap grease. Then, red and yellow completely vanished from my world. I couldn't distinguish the colors in my paint tubes. The water lilies I painted from memory became, in the eyes of others, clumps of dull, murky sludge. I howled in despair in my studio, grabbed a carving knife, and frantically slashed the canvases I had once treasured. I can't see. Everything I paint is trash. It's all dead. The madman who once swore to chase the sun was ultimately locked away in the darkness of his optic nerves. But the ultimate counterattack often happens only after utter destruction. When my eyes could no longer capture the true colors of nature, I simply closed them. Since the light of reality had been extinguished, I would paint the light in my mind. I would paint the light deep within my soul. I had paintbrushes tied to my fingers, which were severely deformed by rheumatism. Standing before a massive canvas over 10 meters long, I completely abandoned all perspective and form. I hurled tons of paint fiercely onto the canvas. Due to the mutation of my vision, the water lilies I painted in my later years took on a terrifying and all-consuming blue and purple hue. Those were no longer the real plants in the Giverny pond. They were the abyss of the universe, the vortex of memory. They were the phantoms I saw during my high fever in Algeria, the icy chill I felt when I nearly drowned at the bottom of the Seine, and above all, that profound, haunting blue that covered Camille's face on her deathbed. In the final moments of my life, I was no longer painting with my eyes. I was using my shattered life to engage in one last, desperate entanglement with this fading world. The story, having reached this point, must now draw to a close. On December 5th, 1926, I finally laid down the paintbrush bound to my hand. Having lived 86 years, after a lifetime of restless pursuit, I can finally go beneath the earth to reunite with that girl in the green dress. My old friend Clemenceau stood beside my coffin. He pulled off the black velvet pall and replaced it with a curtain covered in vibrant floral prints. He understood me. He said, "In Monet's world, there is never absolute black. Indeed, there is no black." Today, if you visit the Musée de l'Orangerie in Paris, you will see two massive oval exhibition halls. There are no frames, no borders, only the magnificent 100-meter-long masterpiece, Water Lilies, completely surrounding you. When you stand in the center of that hall, completely surrounded by those deep blues, intense purples, and dancing ripples of light, I hope you will remember me, this stubborn old man. I hope what you see is not just a pinnacle masterpiece in art history, but a man who spent his entire life defying death and trying to hold back time. The light and shadows in this world are fleeting, impossible to catch or keep. But I, Claude Monet, refuse to accept that. I spent my entire life doing just one thing. I used a lifetime's worth of paint, all just to hold on to one person. December 1926 in Paris, the wind was piercingly cold. I've spent my entire life filling my lungs with tobacco, turpentine fumes, and the dust of cheap paints. Finally, at the age of 86, my lungs declared a total strike. Lung cancer. Sounds terrifying, right? But to be honest, the moment I lay down on this hospital bed, I felt an unprecedented sense of relief. This broken-down machine of mine, which has spent a lifetime chasing light and shadows, can finally stop and rest. I had long since told my family, "Don't give me any pretentious pomp. I don't need the Parisian elites shedding crocodile tears at my funeral. Just give me the simplest ceremony and put me in the ground." However, just as my coffin was about to be buried, something happened that still makes me chuckle to this day. Following tradition, the funeral staff brought over a massive, heavy, lifeless black cloth to drape over my casket. Just as the black cloth was about to be lowered, an old man suddenly charged forward like an enraged lion. It was my dear friend, the former French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau. He grabbed the black cloth, violently hurled it to the ground, pointed at the staff and roared, "Nonsense. In Monet's world there is absolutely no black." He looked around, his eyes locking onto a brightly colored curtain printed with flowers. He roughly tore the floral fabric down, then gently and meticulously draped it over my coffin. "This is Monet," old Georges muttered to himself. Lying inside, if I could still move, I'd want to sit up and give him a massive hug. In this world, apart from Camille, this old man is probably the only one who truly understands me. Yes, even when going to meet death, I will never surrender to the dark. I will take a body full of colors to the next world and continue painting my water lilies. And now, in your screen-dominated era, you look at my paintings in various high-end art galleries. You praise those paintings as warm, bright, and full of poetry. You call me the father of Impressionism and a genius of color. But today, as an old friend, I want to tell you the truth. Let's shatter all those glorified filters placed on historical figures. In this world, there is no such thing as inspiration falling from the sky, nor are there any effortless masterpieces. Behind every stroke of stunning bright yellow and every patch of deep purple you see lies extreme cruelty. It represents hundreds of thousands of brushstrokes made with frozen fingers in the freezing snow. It is the frantic intensity of setting up over a dozen canvases at once like a madman, just to capture the subtle shifts in light every 10 minutes. It is the stubborn grit of clenching a paintbrush tightly in one's teeth, refusing to let go despite countless failures, endless mockery, and even starvation. The true foundation of all those seemingly rare and brilliant artworks is an almost obsessive refinement of skill and an uncompromising, relentless dedication to quality. Want to leave something truly significant in this world? Stop counting on the luck of becoming an overnight sensation. You must first ask yourself if you can withstand the day after day, maddeningly dull grind. My story is told. From the rebellious youth on the beaches of Le Havre to the half-blind old man in the gardens of Giverny, my entire life, in fact, can be summed up in one incredibly boring sentence. To you modern people, I may seem to have lived too narrow a life. You always want to experience 100 different lives, master countless skills, and come out on top in every race. But what about me? I refuse to inherit the family business. I refuse to paint portraits catering to the elite. And after Camille passed away, I even refused to paint anyone else's face. I performed the ultimate subtraction in life. I cut off all my escape routes, pouring all my energy, all my love, and all my madness into a crucible called Impressionism. I spent 86 years proving one thing to this world and to you. As long as you truly settle your heart on one thing, as long as you exhaust your life's strength to study and grapple with it, it is enough to become the pursuit of a lifetime. Enough to let you leave your own eternal, unextinguished light in this vast universe. I found my light, and I immortalized the one I loved. So what about you?